Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Georgia. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown, and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
Giselle Donnelly, I work at the American Enterprise Institute, and
Dalibor Rojas, also with AEI.
On our podcast, we talk about the many challenges to European peace that tend to emerge along a line running from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Eastern Front, and about why those matter to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. Today, we're joined by Shota Khvineria, who was Georgian ambassador to the Netherlands and who is currently lecturing on defense and cybersecurity at the Baltic Defense College. Shota, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start us off with a question about what is going on in Georgia that I think affects a lot of people in Georgia. And your answer might be telling for us looking at it internationally. A few days ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who lives in Georgia and who told me that he is thinking about moving out of Georgia, moving also their kids because they don't want their kids to be growing up in another Russia. Is that something that is inflated or is it capturing something important, Shota?
Well, I would not say that it's in any ways exaggeration to say that the people who work in the civil society organizations and the free media are not safe in Georgia, because now we are observing the trend of transforming the hybrid regime to the full authoritarian regime. And I need to give you a little bit of a context to explain you what is going on in Georgia, because there is no short answer to this. The shortest answer I could give to just indicate and give the flavor to what is going on in Georgia is that there is a Russia's hybrid warfare operation going on in Georgia, but it has not started today. It has not started 5 or 10 years ago. This hybrid operation started since the day one of Georgia regaining independence from the Soviet Union. And Russia has been trying to maintain control over the neighborhood, what it calls the near abroad. So what makes this situation different from all the empires falling apart is that basically Russia has never admitted that because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, now they have to let the neighboring countries, former Soviet Union countries, be fully independent international players, and they still think that they have the right to have the sphere of exclusive influence in their neighborhood. And they're actually fighting for this with the guns in their hands. They're killing us, they're shooting at us because they want us to be the sphere of their exclusive influence. And this hybrid warfare strategy that has been unfolding in the decades has taken different forms. In 2008, for example, there was the hot phase of war, the type of which we see now in Ukraine, unfortunately much more protracted. In Georgia, it was shorter and briefer, but it was exactly the same episode when Russia realized that there was a real risk of losing control over Georgia. That's why they came in with the tanks. The same happened in Ukraine in 2002. Russians thought that there was a real risk of Ukraine breaking away from Russia's control, Russia's sphere of exclusive influence. They realized that the non-military instruments of power were not effective to keep Ukraine under full control. That's why they had to go in and start conventional military operations. So in very short, so what Russia is trying to achieve now in Ukraine through tanks, they're doing it through the political, economic, legal, informational pressure in Georgia, and they have much more success in Georgia than in Ukraine, because now we see that the Georgian government lost ability to resist this hybrid pressure. They cannot actually counter or take any effective measures to prevent Russia from being effectively tightening the grip and the loop on Georgia. And what we see is that in very, very accelerated terms, Georgia is becoming a full authoritarian country, the type of which we see in Belarus, in Russia, and in other countries that fall under the Russian sphere of influence. So this law on foreign agents is just one very little episode, very important, but one little episode of the hybrid warfare that has been there for years. We have been trying to ring the bells alarm our friends, saying that we are losing Georgia, Russia is successful, they have infiltrated most of the strategic domains of Georgia's state building, and basically there is less and less leverage of the Western stakeholders in Georgia, and there is less engagement and less interest of the West. And then this interest cannot hang in limbo. There is no vacuum possible there. And once the Western interests give space, it is automatically filled in by the Russian interests and the Russian influence. And this is what we see in a broader sense. But we can go into the details of how it is played out at this particular time if you're interested.
I think your point about the centrality of Russia in all of this and Russia snapping when Kremlin feels that it's losing control over its previously controlled territories is extremely well taken, and I think I want to come back to it in a second. But before I do that, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the politics of the present moment in Georgia and the prospect for a pro-Western democratic change. The country is having an election on October 26th, and the entire world was watching, I think, very closely the protests and the energy and the sort of level of mobilization. I think it is very well noted that Georgians at large remain very pro-European and want to see closer ties between Georgia and the European Union. Is the idea animating Georgian dream right now that this protest and this energy will fizzle out between now and the election? And is there anything that the opposition can do to prevent that scenario from materializing? I presume the election won't be a fair one, but maybe it will be a free one, or maybe I'm wrong about that. Please do tell us what to expect in the coming 3 months.
Yeah, this is a great question, and that's exactly the point we and everybody interested in Georgia should be discussing, because, some people who are not that much aware of the processes in Georgia, they ask this question, how come that a nation that is predominantly pro-European, pro-Western, pro-democracy has this pro-Russian government which is dragging country into the Russian swamp? How is that possible? And then I understand that people who live in the functional, well-established democracies, they cannot realize that the countries like Georgia live under the state capture. And the way the state capture can be spelled out is that basically the ruling party, one homogeneous political party, has the full control over the legislative branch of government, over the executive branch of government, over the judiciary branch of government. They control most of the strategic, economic, and financial opportunities in the country. They fully control the administrative resource, meaning that the state is the biggest employer in Georgia, with tens of thousands of police officers, military officers, teachers, doctors working for the budgetary institutions that by design are one way or another compelled to be supporting or at least be quiet with regard to the policies of the ruling party. This includes the Central Election Committee, which is the extension of the ruling party. This includes the courts at every level that are not able to take the decisions which are not politically favorable for the ruling party. This includes investigation bodies. And basically, there is no possibility in the circumstances to have a level playfield where any of the opposition parties could achieve any success through the fair play political game. It is just not possible. So in these circumstances where Georgian Dream has the monopoly on all sources of power in the country, the only leverage that could basically lead to free and fair elections was the legitimation from the West and the desire of the Georgian Dream to be a legitimate partner of the West and the Western stakeholders. That's why in the previous elections, despite a lot of shortcomings, despite a lot of different ways of manipulating with the outcomes, it was still somehow kept under the reasonable manipulation levels so that they could still achieve the result they wanted, but it didn't look as ugly as it really was. At this point in time, what is different is that Georgian government actually stopped pretending to be a pro-European, pro-democracy stakeholder. It openly announced that the West is an enemy. The conspiracy theories are now one of the mainstream political messages of the ruling party. They say that there is this global war party trying to drag Georgia into the armed conflict with the Russian Federation, and United States, European Union, these are the enemies. So at this point in time, they have actually stopped thinking about the legitimacy of their rule from the West. They seek the legitimacy of their rule somewhere else. And if we see the chronology of events for last 2 or 3 weeks, what happened is that basically they have adopted this package of laws. It was not only the law on agents, it was the anti-LGBT law, it was the law on offshores, meaning that all the money that is hiding now in different offshores all around the world can come in and out of the country with minimal control and minimal, say, regulation. So it is very high risk that Georgia will become a new kind of a laundromat for all those sanctioned Russian and Belarusian billionaires who are having now a lot of problems and troubles because of the heavy sanctions that are imposed on them. And then in parallel to these laws that fix the authoritarian rule more closely, they have ceremonially attended the funeral of the late Iranian president. Together with Hezbollah and Hamas leaders, they were standing there in front of the coffin, where no delegation from the civilized world was there. In the same week, they actually blamed the EU Commissioner Varhey for threatening the prime minister with sharing the fate of Slovakian Prime Minister Fico. And it was not just the statement that would sleep or be wrapped in the fog of disinformation. It was a straightforward accusation that the prime minister repeated on a number of occasions. After that, they announced that the biggest strategic asset that the Georgia still owns, which is the project of the deep sea port on the Black Sea, is going to the Chinese company, which is sanctioned by the United States for spying and for developing some sort of malign military and intelligence capabilities for Chinese special services. And then in this context, you bring in the topic of the elections. When they have made a very clear statement, they have chosen the side, they have failed to choose the right side in the fight in Ukraine from the outset. They have been unable to support Ukraine in any way, even verbally, and now they're announcing that, okay, this is our platform. See, on one side, there is the West and the global war party and the pro-European, pro-Western forces win in Georgia, then there will be the second front in Georgia. And here we are on the other side, which can guarantee this stability and security and protection of Georgia's identity, Georgia's traditions, and everything that comes with the far-right ultra-nationalist narratives, which is not unique for Georgia, but it's a blend of the pro-Russian propaganda and ultra-nationalist, ultra-right movements that we see all around the world. So this is the status quo. There is no reason to have any hope that this government, at any point in time, even if they receive 5 votes, they will still announce victory in the elections. They will still announce 60% plus in their favor. And that's when the decisive moment will come for the Georgian people to actually fight for their voices, for their votes, and for choice for the free and civilized world.
If I may, I'd like to ask a somewhat provocative follow-up question, and I'm deliberately will sort of frame it a provocative way because this is something that's been on my mind for a while. So when Georgian Dream, when they say we are the ones keeping Georgia out of the war, we have to get along with Russia. If the pro-Western forces win, as you said, there'll be a second front opened in Georgia. I mean, one of the reasons why that seems to work politically is because it is not entirely inaccurate, is it? I mean, what would keep the Russians out of Georgia if indeed there were a sort of pro-Western, pro-democratic change of government in Georgia? I mean, we Georgians remember what happened in 2014 in Ukraine, and it is just not the case that the West has kind of learned its lesson and has put in place security arrangements for Georgia going forward. And unless those security arrangements are put in place, and I don't expect them to, emerge out of the upcoming NATO summit, Georgia will be vulnerable. Am I completely wrong-headed about this?
Well, I would say that is a provocative question indeed, but I think that the answer to the question is more straightforward than it might sound, because Georgia is not a player of the magnitude that can have its own policy in all these geopolitical turbulences. And what happens in Georgia is very, very closely linked to what is going on in Ukraine. So, pragmatically speaking, if I would now play devil's advocate and try to defend Georgian Dream's position, the only rationale that you can see in their policy is that they think they have chosen the winning side. From their perspective and in the world where they live, actually Russia is inevitably winning this war in Ukraine because A, the West has failed to support Ukraine to the extent it needs to achieve any sort of positive outcomes out of this war. We have not even heard the statement of any of the Western leaders saying that they want Russia defeated in Ukraine, even on the statement level. Yes, for how long as it takes and whatever it takes, and we will support Ukraine, but there is actually no policy, or even more so, a strategy of how Ukraine should emerge victorious in this world. So Ukraine cannot win this war of attrition. And right now, what we see in Ukraine is the war of attrition. And it's about how long Ukraine can resist this dynamics of war unless there is a game changer which will change completely the dynamics of the war, which we don't see at this point in time. There is a positive development with allowing Ukraine to use Western weapon systems now deep into the territory of the Russian Federation and take out the military targets close to the borderline, which is, again...
Yeah, not so deep, just a little, right?
Well, militarily speaking, it's ambiguous, let's say. So there is a big progress right there. But again, looking at this from the Russian oligarch's perspective, Bidzina Ivanishvili earned his billions in Russia in early 90s in this mafia type of setting. All his friends, all his inner circle, everybody he is doing business with is now sanctioned in Russia, and they're all Russian oligarchs, and they all see this process through one lens, right? And then he is convinced that basically he does not see any positive outcome there for Ukraine. He thinks that at some point there will be a solution to this war which will end up with the concessions from Ukraine again, and then Ukraine will be forced to somehow accept the peace agreement, which will make all the sacrifice just not feasible or not, let's say, something that it was worth fighting for. And then in these circumstances, he understands that if the West cannot defend Ukraine, how can it defend Georgia? And one specific question that can actually counter question your initial argument is, can the United States or the West in more general terms defend its partners outside NATO or not? And for me, it's very clear. I do not see any choice. I do not see any choice even there, because even if Russia is winning in Ukraine, even if the United States is not able to defend its partners, which are not NATO members at this point in time, still aligning with Russia does not give any benefit for Georgia's national interests. We have seen a lot of examples, and the most recent one is Armenia, that has invested all its resources in its strategic partnership with Russia. It actually based its security policy and strategy on security guarantees from Russia. And we have seen that at the moment when Russians decided that it was not in their interest to be friends with Armenia anymore, it just let Azerbaijan do its job, right? So aligning with Russia does not mean that Georgia can avoid the risk or a threat of the Russian invasion. Just in opposite. More isolated we will be from our Western friends, and more we will be left alone face to face with Russia. This threat of aggression and threat of invasion from the Russian Federation will increase in that particular correlation with the regional settings. But if we're talking about the regime and regime's interests, then it's absolutely different. Because again, there, Bidzina Ivanishvili's lenses, we have to understand that he thinks that he has a choice between the cup of tea with polonium and the sanction. And what do you think is the reasonable choice in his calculus? So now the main thing is to somehow convince him that there is the third option. And there is still the possibility for him to talk about the third option with somebody, and he does not have to dig himself into the choice that he has presented himself with. And there is a way for Georgia to be safe and stable under the Western partnerships, and for him and himself there is another choice other than this two that he is stuck with right now. So one thing is the Georgia's national interests and what Georgian people has basically chosen for decades, and they still see it this way. And for that, of course, any sort of concessions and rapprochement with Russia is a disastrous option, because at this point in time it can delay aggression for a couple of more weeks or months, but in the longer run it makes Georgia more vulnerable to the Russian aggression and more dependable and more dependent on Russian world. We will be more possibilities for Russian aggression we will create. And on the other hand, there is a regime which obviously sees that with the West it can only lose, because the West asks for more democracy, which means less control and less power in the country. It means democratic elections, which by design means, them going out of their offices. And the security issue, of course, is there for the leaders of the Georgian dream, which are scared to death, what Putin will do to them if they not follow his orders strictly and directly. So that's the big picture there.
If I could speak on behalf of the Global War Party, which I've been a member for pretty much all my life, I have to confess that we're not fighting very hard at the moment, and we can do a lot better. But I'm struck that the sort of air of inevitability and fatalism, which you sort of express, is rampant in the West as well. It's been the case that whatever Russia does cannot be undone because it would be too dangerous. However, when people try to claim their own independence or have a color revolution, that's contingent. That can be undone at the whim of Moscow, and we shouldn't do too much about that either. If it's the case that it requires more Western engagement, possibly including military engagement, to save the situation, what would that look like? I mean, paint us a path out of this dark wood that you've abandoned us in.
Okay, so what would be the best trajectory from now on to save Georgia from those disastrous scenarios? Okay, because right now what I see as high probability scenarios, there are three of them. So one is that Georgian Dream ruling party actually wins this fight against the Georgian people. They push this legislation down the throat of the public opinion, and they consolidate the autocracy, and Georgia becomes Belarus. Okay, that's one possibility. The second possibility is that in this process of more authoritarian push, somehow the processes get out of hand and Georgia either engages in the civil unrest, or the Russian Federation actually takes advantage of the destabilization and comes in a more, let's say, pronounced way and takes over the country in a more brutal and pronounced and bold way. And the only possibility to avoid these two scenarios is for the United States to engage on a strategic level with Georgia and create a sense of stability, security, and possibility of democratic development peacefully in that region, in that, let's say, turbulent geopolitical environment where we are right now. So given all the political discourse internally in the United States, with the elections coming up, with everything going on in Ukraine, with everything going on in Gaza, with everything going on, with China and Taiwan and all parts of the world, which requires urgent attention from the United States. I do not see how and under which circumstances basically United States can find either time or resource to strategically push Georgia up on the political agenda once again. Because, the type of change that we need now in Georgia, it's a U-turn type of change. And this does not happen on the level of the State Department's bureaucracy. It's impossible to do that. I'm talking about the strategic level political engagement that is needed at this time. And I see real difficulties in understanding myself how is that possible in the broader picture that we see in wider geopolitics today.
Before I let Yulia wrap us up, let me try to put a little finer point on it and play a little bit of a hypothetical game. Let us suppose that Joe Biden is reelected comfortably without any seizure of the Capitol or any of that kind of stuff, and decides that his legacy is going to be the completion of NATO enlargement in the post-Cold War period.
That's what Giselle has decided for Biden right now, but yeah.
This is why I'm not going to be National Security Advisor or Secretary of State, but this is my program. Yeah, so, we want to incorporate the Eastern Front, first of all in NATO, in the primary security structure of the West, followed by EU accession, etc. The path that others have followed, that has, created what lasting success there has been in the post-Cold War era. I'm assuming that would be, even though the Georgians have had the chair pulled out from under them in the past and have faced a Russian invasion and continuing Russian influence, that would be a ray of hope for Georgians in a way that would have positive effects. Let's just assume that, my brain gets transported to the White House or something like that, or Yulia's brain gets transported to the White House. Why wouldn't that work?
Well, that could work, but first point is that we do not have that much time, and we have these decisive elections in Georgia on October 26th, and if this ruling party finds a way to stay in power after that elections, then it will be an irreversible trend towards Belogruzi. Because there will be no more civil society that fights for Georgia's free and independent future. There will be no critical media that will tell us all the things that are happening in Georgia's political discourse. And we will basically lose the fight for democracy in Georgia. And it will be an irreversible trend towards building more authoritarian regime in Georgia, because this is what we see very clearly Georgian Dream government fighting for. It's not about anything else. It's about full control. It's about building fully authoritarian state, which will enhance the broader authoritarian axis, which is led by Russia, Iran, and other stakeholders in Europe or in Asia. And Georgia will become part of that value system and part of that interest system. And there will be no space or time for reversing that in a longer run trend. And then we will see exactly what we have seen in Belarus, when 1 million people stood out in the street protesting against Lukashenko for 1 month, and nothing happened because the state capture and hollowing all those institutions and subordinating everything to the one leader and one power axis, that's what it does to the countries. It hollows the systems to the extent when there is at some point, a point of beyond repair. And that's what Georgian Dream wants to do. So now on October 26th, there will be a decisive decision point when we will decide whether there will be a space for Georgia to develop positively and integrate itself into the free world, or it will fix itself into the Russia sphere of influence and orbit, and it will become an authoritarian state. So there is very, very little time space. That's why I was so skeptical, and that's why I was saying that I don't see any monumental moves and shifts and U-turns happening in between today and October 26th, because after that, it will be almost impossible to to change the big picture. That's my short answer.
Okay, I'm thoroughly depressed now.
It is, from what I understand, a run against time. And so these elections are crucial. And we can only hope that the White House, that has enough to do, as both of you have pointed out, still has a little bit of energy and, of course, is listening to this podcast. Before we let you go, let me squeeze in one more bucket with a couple of questions, but within the one theme. And that is, we kind of exhausted US options and have literally spelled out our recommendations. What about the EU? Not so long ago, Georgia's EU aspirations seemed, I guess, distant, but somewhat real. Can you give us a projection of the Georgian, not path ahead, I guess, but relationship with the EU, given current circumstances that you've described a bit earlier as well, including the connection with the EU Commissioner? And then also, to add one more question here within the EU bucket, we've just had EU elections with expected but nevertheless dramatic rise in the far right, or right and far right. And so with that in mind, does that affect Georgia's relationship with the EU in any way, given current circumstances?
Yeah, with the EU, things are more complicated because EU is a multinational bureaucratic animal, and taking decisions there quickly is absolutely impossible. So what we have seen there as the EU policy toward Georgia was still based on the pre-Crimean annexation times and geopolitical environment, where Russia was still seen as a partner, but difficult, but still a partner. And then after the full-scale war returned to Europe after 2022, I have not seen any signs that European Union has actually managed to transform its policies to fully fit these new realities and new circumstances where this organization operates. This is again enhanced with the difficulties of making consensus within the organization of 27, because there are stakeholders that openly oppose common foreign and security policies and openly align with the Russian Federation's narratives as well as policies and positions in many cases. So more specifically, talking about the events in Georgia and response from the European Union. At this point in time, what we hear from European Union is that basically there is not much we can do because there is no consensus about how to handle this situation in Georgia. And then going back to Mr. Orban and position of the Slovakian government and some others who have priorities elsewhere, not in the eastern flank, but focus on the threats that are coming from the south, different types of threats with different types of consequences, then you will see that relying on European Union to be a leading power in mitigating or managing this kind of huge crisis, it's not realistic. So that's why I made that much emphasis on the United States and strategic engagement from the United States, that this must be done under the leadership of the US. And then the European Union can fill in and follow the suit and play its part in this bigger, let's say, strategy, which will be the broader Western strategy led by the United States. But short of that, I do not honestly see the possibility of European Union managing somehow to play a leading role in either handling the crisis in Georgia or even more so in Ukraine, which, as we already analyzed, are so closely interconnected and affecting one another. I would say what is happening in Georgia will affect the dynamics of war in Ukraine, because if Georgia fully falls under the Russian rule, then it will strengthen Russia's possibilities of protracting this war even further. It will give Russia more possibilities of sanctions evasion. It will give Russia more possibilities for getting access to the materials that they need to maintain the war and produce more weapons. It will give Russia access to more money laundering patterns. It will give Russia more access access to the trading routes and markets to get more weapons for their fight against Ukraine in many different geopolitical areas. So it's not just about, tiny little Georgia and decisions of Georgian government to align with one side or another. It's about either strengthening Russia's war effort or making it more difficult for Russia to maintain this war. This is what is at stake in the bigger geopolitical picture. That's why I hope that despite Georgia being so small, it basically is so important from that bigger power struggle between authoritarian and democratic players, I would say, in a bigger picture, that maybe that will trigger some serious political thinking and decisions in Washington and Brussels. That's what I hope for. I don't see much specific signs for that at this point in time, to be honest, but I think there is still time for decisive actions on top of the rhetoric and announcements and condemnation of what we see in Georgia. There should be a very, very clear action in very short period of time, and there is still hope that we will be able to reverse this tragic and very unfavorable trends that we see.
That sounds, Shotad, like based on very well argued positions, you're a true Atlanticist.
I consider myself as one, for sure.
Yeah, like most Georgians, right? Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. This is a good way to end this episode and hope that we are being heard and that Georgia's voices are being heard both in Brussels as well as in Washington. From my colleagues, Giselle Donnelly and Dalibor Rohac, and me, Yulia Zsoja, thank you for listening to the Eastern Front. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing us. To stay up to date with the Eastern Front, give us a follow on Twitter or X at Eastern Front Pod, and sign up for a newsletter included in the show notes. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, ai.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.